The Porsche Cayenne Turbo GT is a really goofy buyer's proposition because despite it being a family SUV meant to haul around the family in a sporty style, it'll probably never be utilized to its full potential by 99% of people who buy that car. Because despite it being more than likely the fastest production SUV on the Nürburgring, that means almost nothing to literally everyone who buys this car because people don't buy their SUVs to take on the track. Somehow everyone's managed to sleep on the most powerful Cayenne, which is not the Turbo GT. It's actually this, the new Turbo E-Hybrid, and it also happens to have a lightweight sport package that makes it look identical to the Turbo GT. So today's video is not only why this might be the ultimate Cayenne period, but it might also be the ultimate SUV period. So when taking a look at this thing, you have the massive 22-inch wheels with the carbon ceramic brakes, you have the big old carbon roof, you have the carbon diffuser, the dual exit center exhaust tips. When I first saw this thing in person, I thought this was a Cayenne Turbo GT, and that's because you can option a lightweight sport package that essentially gives you 90% of what the Turbo GT has aesthetically. And so the only thing you're missing is the more aggressive front roof spoiler, the slightly wider and more aggressive front intake grills, and then a front lip as well. But I mean, hey, to pay less money to get 90% of the Turbo GT's aesthetic experience, I think that's a pretty good deal. This car as optioned is sitting around $195,000, which I mean makes this substantially cheaper than a Turbo GT. Overall, I like the way this car looks though. I think it's even more of a sleeper look than the actual Turbo GT, and if you wanted it to look exactly like the Turbo GT, you would just have to buy a few aftermarket parts and boom, you're done. Hopping into the interior, there isn't much that's different from a Turbo GT or even a base Cayenne at all from a functionality standpoint. The Turbo GT is gonna get a lot more Porsche race text throughout the entire interior as standard, whereas this has more leather as standard, but this spec has the houndstooth inserts in the seats, which looks really good. I have done a full deep dive into this new generation of Cayenne's interior as far as the tech and livability, and so if you want to learn more about that, you can watch my base Cayenne review where I get more in depth with the technology and how this new generation of Cayenne functions overall on the inside. But one thing I will mention is that I have kind of gotten over the lack of a ignition switch replaced by the start-stop button and then the analog tachometer in the middle. Those things are no longer here in this generation, but I don't know, it's not really bothering me that much, maybe because this isn't the super heritage-focused two-door sports car that it's not bothering me as much, but I don't mind the fully digital gauge cluster. And I know 3 months ago I probably would have been like shooting myself in the foot for saying that, but it doesn't really bother me that much anymore here. But just like the other Cayenne models, this is still a super nice place to be, and I feel like it's a lot cleaner than its platform sharing sibling, the Urus. I feel like the Urus is so much more of an event every time you get inside the car, but I feel like the new Cayennes, especially in the sportier trims, have a very premium and sporty aesthetic, but not to the point of being loud or kind of shouty. Some people might use the word obnoxious, but that really all comes down to personal preference. If you're an Urus aesthetic kind of guy, this car probably was never going to do anything for you. But I've always been the type of guy that prefers an R8 over a Huracan or an Alpina B8 over an M8. It really comes down to personal preference. But the performance though, the performance is really impressive, and I have a lot to talk about regarding performance. So let's get into that, starting with the launch control. All right, this is one I'm thoroughly excited for just because I know this thing should hook up pretty well. All-wheel drive, 730 horsepower. It's about 70 degrees. We've driven the car for about 45 minutes prior to getting here. And yeah, I think we should be at ideal conditions to get a pretty solid launch. If I were to get predictions, I'm gonna guess between 3.2 and 3.1. But let's see what we do. We're on some freshly paved road, which is very nice. So let's do this. Whoa! Whoa! Oh boy, that actually did not hook the way we wanted to do. We went a little sideways there. A little sideways there. Oh yeah, that was not ideal. That was actually really scary. All right, whew. Maybe we should try that again. I don't know. All right, let's try this again. That hooked way better. Way better. Way better. Okay, good. That was much better. All right, so we did a 3.5. That is actually significantly worse than I thought we'd do. I think we're gonna give this one a cool down period and then try it again. But I think, yeah, I feel like we should be able to do better. Let's let her cool down for a little bit and then we'll give it another run. All right, we gave it a nice cool down. Let's see what we can do now. That felt about the same, but let's see what we did. Dang, we got slower, 3.6. These are not the most impressive numbers, I'm not gonna lie to you. I'm definitely feeling a little bit of bog off the line. Let's give it one more go. All right, we're not getting launched for whatever reason. Let's try this one more time. Yeah, she's not going. She's not budging. For now, I think we might have to live with the 3.5 is our best time. Which, I mean, is disappointing for sure. We've definitely gotten better numbers out of SUVs, but let's keep it real. If you want to buy an SUV for track performance, you wouldn't buy an SUV. That's because these things are so freaking big and heavy, and they're just not intended to do that sort of stuff, despite them being extremely capable when you have Porsche making cars like this. But this car is a very prime example of a big and heavy SUV. This Turbo E-Hybrid weighs 5,600 pounds, which makes it one of the few vehicles in the world that's heavier than the new M5. That's a big deal. But we've not only got 730 horsepower and 700 pound-feet of torque with the turbo and hybrid motor setup combined, but we have Porsche's magical suspension setup that makes this car feel like it handles on rails. This car is optioned with Porsche's PDCC, which is Porsche Dynamic Chassis Control, which keeps this car absolutely planted in the corners. Those electromechanical actuators in the front and the rear of the car make sure this thing stays absolutely planted when you need it to be. You also have rear axle steering optioned in this car, which isn't as noticeable as I thought it would be, and I feel like that's a good thing because I feel like some manufacturers like Mercedes have these really overbearing rear axle steering systems that feel almost too noticeable and kind of get in the way of you having fun with the car. You want the car to take corners very well. You want it to have a solid turning radius when trying to parallel park and back into parking spots and things like that. But when you want to have fun, you don't necessarily want the front and rear wheels to almost feel like they're turning in complete synchronization. That kind of eliminates the fun factor a little bit. Porsche's rear axle steering system is very subtle in this Turbo E-Hybrid application, and it just helps the car dance more effortlessly than it does get in the way of you having actual fun with the car. But the most surprising and most fun part of this driving experience as a whole has to be coming from that twin turbo V8. It's just so alive. It's got a really throaty acceleration sound, and even at idle when you're standing perfectly still, you get this nice little sound that I feel like a lot of new V8 SUVs just lack. Part of that, I'm sure, is coming from the sport exhaust system that is optioned on this car, and thank God for that, because it truly does have 2 times the driving sensation from a sound perspective. There's absolutely no shortage of pops and bangs and nice little burbles on the overrun. You just really hear and feel everything that's going on with this V8 in this car, and I feel like that's just something that a lot of new V8 performance cars, especially the SUVs, are lacking. I drove the new X5M earlier this spring, and I honestly just wasn't that moved by it, quite honestly, but I feel like this has to be the most fun V8 SUV I've driven this year, and the most fun V8 powered SUV, and probably the most fun SUV period I've reviewed on this channel to date. Those are big words, but I mean, seriously, this V8 is just such a good time. Like, listen to those pops. It's just like, it's not a rare thing for it to just give you the pops, the bangs. As soon as you downshift, It just gives it to you. You don't have to ask. You don't have to work hard for it. Even at low speeds, you're getting nice little fun sounds when shifting. Even in automatic mode, you don't have to, fiddle with the transmission to get those nice sounds that you want to hear. It just gives you everything you want without having to work for it. Normally with these new V8 powered SUVs, I'm like, yeah, it's solid, but with an aftermarket exhaust, I know it'd be really crazy. But with this car, no, it's perfectly fine bone stock. The steering feel also remains really great with these new Cayennes. It's weighty, direct, you get a lot of feedback. It really is suitable for an enthusiast to get in here and start having some fun with. Honestly, the only SUV I've driven this year that has better steering is the Ferrari Purosangue, but that car costs as much as 2.5 of these. So I mean, it's not really that simple to compare the two. The transmission tuning is also remarkable in this car, and it really doesn't make me miss not having Porsche's dual clutch PDK in this car at all. I've actually been driving this car and the new Bentley Continental Hybrid back to back, which also uses a Volkswagen derived turbo V8 and a hybrid setup. Only difference is that that car is using Porsche's PDK dual clutch, and it's certainly more eventful to go up and down in the gearbox in this car, letting you get those downshifts a lot sooner when coming to a stop, as opposed to Bentley with the PDK, which is a bit more conservative. And it just really leads me to believe that it all comes down to the tuning of these transmissions, because the hardware of the ZF 8-speed and a lot of these performance cars are very similar. It just comes down to how the manufacturers tune the transmission to work and operate, and Porsche usually does a really great job at that, and the Cayenne is a prime example. It really feels identical to the PDK that you have in like the new Panamera, for example, in terms of responsiveness, aggressiveness, smoothness. It really does all the things you want very well. The carbon ceramic brakes in this car are also insane. They're some of the biggest brake setups you can get on a car right now. You've got 17-inch discs up front and 16-inch discs at the back, with a 10-piston caliper in the front and a 4-piston caliper in the rear, which is absolutely insane. Obviously, this car stops like nobody's business, right? But more so than that, I'm really impressed with the modulation and tuning of the brake setup in this car. And I'd honestly think you'd be insane to option the carbon ceramics on this car, given how heavy and how powerful it is, if you're actually going to do spirited driving in this thing. But outside of all that, I'm really impressed with how well they've modulated and tuned these brakes to come to a stop. I've found with a lot of performance cars that come with carbon ceramic brakes as an extra option, they can be very grabby and squeaky and just uncomfortable to use in everyday situations. But here I feel like they've modulated these and tuned these very well to come to a very smooth stop when you want it to, but also be very aggressive and bitey when you need it to be. I feel like the best brakes are the ones you don't have to think about when doing spirited driving. And braking in this car is an effortless experience. They don't squeak, they don't make any noise, they're not super grabby at low speeds. They're honestly really great, and I'd highly recommend you get these if you plan on actually having fun in this car. And hey, maybe if you even take it on the track, maybe it'd be good for that as well. Now, I think I've made it quite clear why this car is equally as fun and as capable as the Turbo GT for the street, outside of maybe 0 to 60. But here's why I think this car is actually a little bit better. And that all comes down to Porsche's tuning of the hybrid system. I think what they've done here is made it feel as close to a naturally aspirated car as I think you could possibly get. Unlike other hybrid performance cars where you can literally feel the multiple stages of power kicking in, the acceleration is just so seamless and smooth that I legit think you could trick people into thinking this isn't even a hybrid setup. And because you have 340 pound-feet of torque from the electric motor at your disposal, at any point in the rev range, you give it a nice little shove, and even from a rolling start, the acceleration is super smooth before those turbos spool up. But when you want those turbos to be turned off completely, boom, pop it into electric mode and you can have a very peaceful, smooth, quiet drive for up to 40-ish miles at a max speed of 87 miles per hour. Not bad. I'm not the type of guy that necessarily needs this hybrid setup with the 40 miles of electric range, but what it has been useful for is allowing me to drive the car and let it cool down in between breaks of doing, performance testing and whatnot. I need to make sure the engine's at an ideal temp. When doing normal, everyday driving, it certainly isn't the softest or most plush ride experience out there. I certainly think something like a GLE 63 ride's a little bit softer. But you have 3-chamber air suspension. You're not just riding on steel springs, and I think it's certainly firm in Sport and Sport Plus mode, but it's definitely still very much dailyable, and I think that's a trade-off most people who are opting for the second sportiest Cayenne model could be willing to make. I've driven this car in stop-and-go traffic in pretty much every scenario possible at this point, and I've had zero fatigue driving this car around every day. It's been absolutely fine for me. There are other cars like the X5M, X6M that don't necessarily offer the same benefits. Those cars ride a little firm. But to sum it up, this car has endless amounts of torque and a ridiculous top end, handles like a freaking beast even on these tight back roads. It's the most usable and versatile version of the V8 Cayenne, and it has nearly all the aesthetic flair of the flagship model. And so, if you're already committed to buying the big and heavy SUV, why not get the one that can do more for you? For me, it's no contest. This is definitely the one I'd take. So this car is quicker and cheaper than a base model Urus, and it'll also probably be within 1/10 of the speed of the new hybrid Urus, which is also a lot more expensive than this car. It also happens to be more powerful and more usable than the Cayenne Turbo GT at less of a cost. And so if you don't want a naturally aspirated V12, I think this immediately shoots up to the very top of my list for performance SUVs that I'd recommend you buying at this price range. I think this car pretty much does it all. Engagement, quality of life, practicality, and still offers a premium flagship experience. This SUV is still crazy expensive, don't get me wrong, but I think it's crazy worth it. But that's gonna be about it for this video. If you enjoyed, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for future content like this. More V8 hybrid content coming very, very soon. And if you want to support the channel, we have merch. This is just one of a few designs we have available on carswithmiles.com. Alrighty, talk to you guys in the next one.